Good evening, everyone. My name is Igor Volsky. I'm the Executive Director of Guns Down America, and I'm truly honored to be moderating tonight's conversation about ending the special immunity for the gun industry. This event is co-sponsored by Guns Down America, Survivors Empowered, and Giffords. And of course, we're so happy to be joined by Congressman Adam Schiff of California's 28th District. Tonight, our conversation will focus on the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCAA. It's a 2005 law that provides immunity for gun manufacturers, distributors, and dealers, and protects them from most negligence and products liability actions in state and federal court. Tonight, we have a truly esteemed panel. Along with Congressman Schiff, we're joined by Sandy and Lonnie Phillips, who lost their daughter Jessie in the 2012 movie theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, and were later forced to file for bankruptcy as a result of Placa. Robin Thomas, she's the executive director of the Giffords Law Center, and Ryan Busey, a longtime former executive at one of the country's top gun manufacturers and the author of the upcoming, and I must say, very good book, Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America. Ryan is now also an advisor to Giffords. As we have our conversation, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and I will sprinkle those questions into our conversation. But with that, Congressman Schiff, let me start with you. Earlier this month, you introduced the Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act. It's a bill that would effectively give gun violence survivors and victims their day in court against the firearm industry. Of course, your legislation comes as the country grapples with rising homicides, rising mass shootings, an increase in political violence that threatens our elections and our very democracy. What responsibility does the firearm industry have for this growing public health crisis that we're all now experiencing? And how would your bill help save lives?
Well, thank you for the question, and thanks for moderating our discussion tonight. When the gun industry passed Placa back in 2005, it was the NRA's top priority, and for a very good reason. At that time, a lot of cities were taking action against those who were negligently selling guns, a lot of them cheap, what we called at the time Saturday night specials, that were going into the hands of people that were using them to kill their neighbors, kill people in the public in daily acts of gun violence. And they were bringing nuisance litigation against the makers of these dangerous products for not exercising the degree of care, reasonable standard of care for the communities where they operated. That bill gave the gun industry an immunity that no other industry enjoyed. If you make any other dangerous product, then you're responsible if you're negligent. You're not responsible for someone else's negligence, but you're responsible for your own negligence. But this essentially gave the industry a very large pass. Indeed, the NRA also immunized itself. Even trade associations were included. So it was the highest priority of the industry at the time, and shamefully it was passed by the Congress. And for the last 5 to 10 years, I've been working hard to try to repeal it, to try to make sure that the gun industry, like any other industry, acts with reasonable care. And that means that I think if we're successful in repealing the law, that victims of gun violence can have their day in court. They can hold the industry to the same standard any other industry would be held to. If gun sellers are selling to straw purchasers and turning a blind eye to that, they shouldn't get a pass. And I think if they don't get a pass, they'll exercise greater care. They'll make their products more safely so that we don't have so many accidental shootings and killings in households. And so, yes, it will save lives. I do have to say that because the gun industry views this as an existential protection, it's likely to be among the most difficult common sense gun safety measures to pass, but it's also, I think, one of the most important. And so we're going to continue to push hard. Very grateful for all the support of everyone on this call, and particularly grateful to President Biden, who singled this out and said if there was one common sense gun safety measure that he would support over others, it was this one, signaling his recognition of the need to make sure that this industry acts responsibly. Look, good actors in the industry don't need this protection, and the bad actors don't deserve it. And so we press forward, and with your help and grassroots activists around the country, we're going to fight till we get this job done.
Thank you, Congressman. Robin, let me go to you and ask you to say a bit more about what makes this shield unique. And how would you respond to Americans who may argue, look, it simply doesn't make sense to hold the firearms industry accountable for the criminal actions of individuals?
So first of all, just want to say thank you for hosting this event, and thank you to Representative Schiff and Lonnie and Sandy Phillips and Ryan for joining us today. This is such an important issue, and I think why it's such an important issue goes back to what Representative Schiff was just saying, which is that sometimes the courts are an incredibly important place to ensure accountability. If you look at tobacco, if you look at a better example, car safety, litigation in the courts is often an incredibly powerful way to motivate an industry to choose to do the right thing, in part because they understand that if they don't, they will be held accountable in that venue. And when you remove that incentive, that motivation for them to choose to do the right thing because of that, you actually empower an industry to almost be negligent without any consequence, which is what we've really found here. So I think, the backstory, and Representative Schiff referred to it a bit, is that there were a number of lawsuits being brought in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. Some of them were getting traction and success because it turns out the industry, like any industry, if there's a way to make the product safer to prevent accidents and injuries, there's an obligation to do so. If you don't, as a product, as a company, that's negligence. Well, when you remove that, because many of these manufacturers and dealers were acting in a negligent manner and it was causing harm. And so they knew if they passed Placa, no one would be able to hold them accountable in court. And they unbelievably were successful in doing it, even with such an inherently dangerous product. You said something, I think your second question, what do I say to people who think that the industry, will be held accountable and disappear? Is that the...
Well, who believe that isn't it the individual who commits the criminal act, who picks up the firearm and murders an individual or a group of people? Aren't they responsible for the outcome and not the manufacturer or the dealer of that firearm?
It's actually an interesting question. I'm going to try to not get too wonky down the legal road, but suffice it to say that the common law already deals with that issue, that question, right? It's not just the gun industry, it's in any tort. When you look at a harm that's caused, the judge, the jury, the common law will look at the facts of the case, and they might parse out. Maybe part of this had to do with the joint and several liability or the action of an individual, and maybe part of it had to do with how that individual got the gun in the first place. And maybe both parties have some liability that ended in a tragedy or whatever event. So the common law provides for this intervening criminal act to be considered as part of the liability equation. Under that logic, for example, if a young person, someone under the age of 18, gets a hold of a gun, whether it's through the negligence of the industry and their marketing, whether it's through the negligence of a dealer, in theory, because that person is underage, it's illegal for them to have the gun. So there's no responsibility by the industry, even if it's not necessarily a criminal act of the normal kind. So it really just obviates any ability to look at the facts of these situations, the way the industry is behaving, and to consider it in context of what they could do and still sell their products, but do it in a way that has greater safety, that protects people's lives, that prevents accidents. What is the motivation to make improvements in these products to make them safer if there's no accountability built in? In fact, there's actually motivation the opposite. Why would if one gun manufacturer makes their product safer, now all of a sudden there's a differential amongst the rest of the industry, which is one of the ways that we can assess the need for safety. So there's actually an incentive to not make these products safer now, which is really sort of a shocking outcome of all of this. And I'll leave it there. We can sort of circle back on some of the dense stuff, but hopefully that answered your question.
Can I just jump in on that too? Because I can give you a very concrete example involving a police officer from my hometown of Burbank, California, who was shot and killed. And he was shot and killed by a gang member that got the gun from a straw purchaser. And a straw purchaser is someone not legally entitled to, a straw purchaser is someone who is buying the gun generally for people who are not eligible to own a firearm. So in this case, if that gang member has a felony record and is disqualified from getting a gun, they might go to a straw purchaser. Now, it's certainly true that the gang member who shot and killed this police officer is responsible for murder. But if the gun dealer was turning a blind eye, was selling, massive quantities of guns to a single person, and should have known that person wasn't going to use all those guns themselves, and was essentially a straw purchaser for the gang, then there is liability, or there should be, on behalf of that seller. But in this case, when the family of that deceased police officer brought suit, the gun seller moved to dismiss the case, and they were successful under Placa in dismissing the case. And among the many problems is, because you can dismiss a case on the basis of this Placa law, the victim's family can't even get discovery, can't even find out about the record of that dealer and how many other guns may have been sold to that same straw purchaser, how many of other people may have been the victims of murder as a result. So that's a perfect, I think, illustration of where there's shared liability. Yes, murder for the person who pulled the trigger, but there's also liability if someone allowed that gun to get into the wrong hands and did so through their negligence.
Sandy and Lonnie, you know the consequences of negligent dealers all too well. After your daughter Jessie was killed in the Aurora Theater shooting on July 20th, 2012, you sued Lucky Gunner, which is an online ammunition store that sold the bullets used by the gunman to kill your daughter and 11 other people. Tell us more about how this law, how this special shield impacted you.
Well, we're the people that the gun lobby point to when they want to show a textbook example of what happens to anyone brave enough to or foolish enough to try a civil case that would challenge the Protection of Lawful Commerce Act. Just like many of you on this call, we do not consider ourselves overly brave or foolish, but it is possible that a traumatic event such as the senseless murder of your child could cause you to cloud your judgment. Early in our grief period, while one of us was in depression stage and one of us was in the anger stage, we made a foolish mistake. We were employed by an established and trusted organization that asked us to be the lead plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit that would challenge the Protection of Lawful Commerce Act. But we ran into trouble right away. We, our pro bono attorneys, could convince any of the survivors of the Aurora Theater massacre to commit to such a gamble. They all cited fear of Placa, rightly so. We, however, trusted our employers' attorneys because they had experience and a good track record of winning lawsuits in this arena. So we were assured by them that our employers were financially secure enough to take care of any fees that the judge might assess. But we were not brave enough to go it alone, knowing that the defendants could come at us with, "You're trying to profit on your daughter's death. Shame on you." Some of the juries would believe it. So we made the stipulation that we would go forward only if they dropped the demand for money. What we really wanted was injunctive relief that would force them to change their dangerous practices, selling large orders of lethal military-grade armament without proper vetting.
After months of posturing, which produced a staggering amount of billable hours for the NRA attorneys, they presented the first motion. And the first motion was to dismiss, which the judge granted and awarded the defendants $264,000. There is no dispute in the Colorado law that when somebody brings a suit of this kind, that the reasonable attorney fees will be granted. And by employing that mandatory word shall, those statutes were awarded. It may be presumed that whatever hardship is imposed on the individual plaintiffs, that these awards against them may be paid by the sponsors of this action in their name, was what the judge actually said in his opinion. And that didn't happen. We tried for 3 years to get the sponsors, our former organization of this action in our name, to come to our aid with no success. However, they did manage to get the fees reduced to $203,000, but refused to contribute any funds to help us with that. We finally had to declare bankruptcy in 2017 to keep our home from being sold to pay the judgment. After the bankruptcy was final, we were fortunate enough to get a consulting contract with Giffords, an organization that is much more in tune with our ideas of supporting survivors and giving power and empowering survivors of gun violence as advocates for change. And we are eternally grateful for that. And we thank you, Representative Schiff, for taking a leadership role, holding the gun industry accountable. We've met before in your office, and I truly appreciate your dedication to this effort. It is the one thing that will change the whole dynamic of gun violence in America and the laws around it. The Placa law, as we know, was the crowning glory for the NRA, who has been losing similar cases for years before the passing of this federal law. And this is the most significant barrier to the comprehensive gun violence prevention strategies of almost everyone in this movement. The law not only denies victims of gun violence their day in court and their constitutional right, but also encourages gun makers to continue business practices that will foreseeably lead to more violence.
Thank you, Sandy and Lonnie. Before we go to Ryan, I just want to encourage the audience to submit your questions, and we will get to them shortly. Ryan, so you were a top executive in the firearms industry during the period that, as Sandy was saying, this Placa law became a real priority for the NRA and for the industry. Take us inside the industry during that period. Why was this so important to them? What was going on at the time? And how did you see during your period with them, how did you see the industry's behavior change once that law was enacted and signed into law in 2005?
Yeah, thanks, Igor. I think, as will become apparent here this evening, I'm not a legal scholar, a legislative hero like Robin or Congressman Schiff. I'm not an expert on Placa. I stand out here tonight because I'm an active hunter, I'm an active shooter, I'm a gun owner. My kids are gun owners, my friends are gun owners, and frankly, the responsible use of guns is an important part of my life, and just like it is with my friends, and like a lot of people who own guns, I don't like the thought of gun companies going away. That doesn't mean I'm unconcerned. It doesn't mean that I can ignore the obvious realities that I lived and our country endures today. And I'm here tonight because I want folks to know that there are millions of people like me, gun owners, who want to be a part of the solution and not be a part of the problem. To that end, and to your question, all I can do here this evening is tell you what I experienced throughout my career, and certainly prior to the mid-2000s. Placa was passed in 2005, as Congressman Schiff noted. Prior to the mid-2000s, things were a lot different in the firearms industry than they are today. And without going into too much detail or just reading chapters from my book, let's just say there was an understood and strict system of decency and self-policing. And I'll give you just a few examples so you can see how things changed. First, prior to about 2006 or 2007, and this is an illustrative example, display of tactical products in the largest trade show in the industry was strictly prohibited in the consumer portion of the show, which is the largest part of the show. It wasn't a law, it wasn't a statute, it was just simply self-imposed industry practice. Tactical guns and gear did exist, but there was a law enforcement and military section for that type of gear. And in order to enter or display in those spaces, special credentials had to be in hand. You had to be a trainer, a member of a law enforcement agency, somebody from the military, and the NSSF, which is the industry trade group, and it's literally made up of all of the gun companies. They would essentially police the entire show and remove even tactical vests, the same vest that you saw Oath Keepers and 3%ers wear on January 6th. Not even those could be displayed in any of the large consumer part of the SHOT Show, which is 95% of the SHOT Show. If you fast forward to today, this stuff absolutely dominates the entire show. So since about 2006, 2007 to now, it has taken over the entire industry. I'm not saying that's causal from Placa, but obviously Robin or Congressman Schiff, experts on it, probably could draw some causal links. The second example I'll give you, and for me an illustrative example, new product development in the gun industry is the lifeblood of any company. And prior to 2006, 2007, about that time frame, as new products would be developed, people like me and marketing professionals would go through a strict naming process, and we would name guns, but that would have to go through a very tightly controlled process with attorneys who never wanted to cross over any line to name things that might be irresponsible, that might incite violence, that might name a gun something that that would encourage somebody to do something very irresponsible with it. And that's why for decades we got guns like the Model 629 from Smith & Wesson, or the Kimber Custom Classic, or the Model 700 from Remington. If you fast forward to today, whatever line did exist has been completely destroyed, or we're jumping over it, we're leaping over it every second, because today you literally have guns that are named the Ultimate Arms Warmonger, or we have AR-15 variants that are called the Urban Super Sniper. These are literal guns. These are literally gun names. So that old self-policing marketing in a way that didn't encourage irresponsible behavior has been replaced by warmongers and urban super snipers. The last example, one that I know is very, very close to Congressman Schiff, is it involves a dangerous increase in what I think is the acceptance of radicalization and the use of radicalization by the gun industry. Just a few years ago, not a single gun company would have been caught within 1,000 miles of somebody like Kyle Rittenhouse. All gun companies would have quickly distanced themselves from tactical open carry, loaded AR-15 carrying guys who invaded capitals in Michigan or Kentucky or wherever. That just was not accepted. Less than a dozen years ago, probably 8 or 10 years ago, industry protocol would have required that every gun company would have quickly condemned the domestic terrorism that we saw on January 6th, especially since much of it was highlighted with AR-15 come and take it flags. But now, I mean, there's nothing. I've listened, I've watched, there's nothing. The only thing that I've heard is actually some praise for Kyle Rittenhouse. It's just a dangerous addiction to radicalization. It's like a drug it's like a drug that the industry can't get off of. And I just want to reiterate, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm just reporting what I saw, but I know that all this is not good for our country, and I know it's not sustainable, and something has to change.
Ryan, let me just follow up quickly and ask you that in 2000, Smith & Wesson and the Clinton administration did come together and made a series of announcements of how they would be taking and creating greater, adding safety features to some of their products. They were shunned by the industry during that time, as you describe, as the industry was moving towards a direction of greater radicalization and militarization. And then, of course, as you note, once Placa came into being in 2005, that appears to have really opened the floodgates to even more irresponsible behavior. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how that Smith & Wesson experience in 2000, how it impacted the industry and how the industry reacted and responded to what Smith & Wesson had agreed to under the Clinton administration.
So if I do a book tour, I'm going to hire you to tease chapters in my book, because this is a prominent chapter in the book. But the Smith & Wesson adventure in 2000 really set the stage for the sort of strict, sort of totalitarian police state that we now have that governs the firearms industry, because Smith & Wesson stepped out of line. The NRA essentially amassed the forces against one rogue player. That Smith & Wesson was sold in 1987 for $112 million after their experience being boycotted, almost being run out of business in 2000. It sold, the entire company sold for $15 million after that experience, because it was essentially boycotted to death. The experience that the industry and the message that the industry got was very clear. Not a single person ever, not a person, not a company, not even the largest, most iconic company. And at the time, Smith & Wesson had brand recognition that was neck and neck across the globe with Coca-Cola. It wasn't a second-tier brand. So the industry went after Smith & Wesson, sent a clear message, and that's why today you see no one step out of line. That was a very seminal event.
Robin, I want to ask you this, because Ryan referenced it, and Congressman Schiff, I think you'll want to answer it as well. Robin, you alluded to it. The other argument that we hear of, if you allow for lawsuits to go forward, if Congressman Schiff's bill were to become law, that you would see gun manufacturers go out of business, that it would in some way shrink the industry. Certainly in 2005, that's the argument you heard from the industry. How do you respond to that?
I'll start just really quickly and then happy to pass it off to Representative Schiff. But, you know, I just think that that's one of those slippery slope arguments, right? So you look at something like car safety, and in theory, you could argue that allowing individuals to sue the industry for defective products or negligently marketed products would have taken car companies off the market. And we certainly can't have that happen. But that's not what happened. What happened was the car industry began to voluntarily adopt safety practices, make their product safer. There are all kinds of reforms. I find there's such a good analogy between car safety and gun safety, because we have a lot of cars in this country and we have a lot of guns in this country. And if you approach cars and guns the same way and say, okay, what did we do? We had lots and lots of car deaths and car injuries in the early days of the industry 50 years ago, when there were lots of cars on the road and lots of people getting hurt. And there was really a comprehensive public health approach taken, everything from making cars themselves safer, collapsible steering columns and crumple zones and, non-shattering windshields and on and on and on. We also made the roads safer, right? We also made banked curves and better speed limits, et cetera. We changed behavior around driving. We made drunk driving illegal and really emphasized how socially unacceptable that was. All kinds of things. And we took this really comprehensive approach to how do we have all these cars on the road and yet make people safer, allow it to be less damaging than it is. And we've reduced car injury and car death in America in the last 50 years by 80%. And we have more cars than ever on the road. But somehow with this comprehensive public health model, we've saved countless lives from being injured and killed in car crashes. So if we look at guns the same way, this is a prolific product. It exists in our society. It's not necessarily going to change anytime soon. what can we do to take a comprehensive approach to dramatically reducing gun death and gun injury? And the amazing thing here is that there are solutions to the problem. If we approached it the same way, if we passed laws that change behaviors, if we made the product safer, if we changed sort of some of the social norms around what's acceptable in our civil society, we could do the same thing with guns. And one of the impediments is a law like this, because making guns safer as a product, allowing that, I think forcing or pressuring them to be sold in a safer manner to create accountability on both ends would have a dramatic improvement. Many of you on the panel list know this already, but actually most gun dealers are really good folks that are following all the rules and doing a good job of trying to keep their products out of the wrong hands. And then there's this tiny minority of dealers and manufacturers that are really intentionally either, putting products into the wrong hands or marketing particularly dangerous products. I think it's 2% of the dealers that are providing 60% of the illegal market. So we need to do a better job of finding out who those dealers are. We need to resource ATF. We need to create accountability in the courts, and we need to hold them accountable, because by reducing, guns start in the regular market. It's not like other types of products like drugs that start in the black market and are much harder to regulate. Guns start in the legal market. And if we could find a way to regulate them more intelligently, which includes liability for those who are intentionally putting them in the wrong hands, we could make dramatic improvements to this problem. So I think, it all kind of fits together. There's a larger puzzle here, and this is just such an important piece of that puzzle that changes attitudes, that creates self-accountability, that could, I think, dramatically move the needle. And I'll pass it over to Representative Schiff if there's more on that.
Well, thank you. And Robin, you did a perfect job answering the question. You analogize it to the auto industry. I often analogize it to the alcohol industry, in the sense that, let's look at someone who runs a bar, who is a seller of alcohol, and or has a liquor store. If someone kills somebody drunk driving, yes, they're responsible for that death, the drunk driver. But if the bar is knowingly selling alcohol to someone that is underage, or continues plying someone with drinks and knowing that they're behind the wheel, the liability isn't automatic. You still have to prove to a jury or to a judge that they weren't exercising a reasonable standard of care. But we don't say that all liquor sales should be immunized from liability. We don't say all bars and liquor stores should have immunity. And the reason we don't is we want them to exercise reasonable care. And as a result, as you were describing with the car industry, when it comes to drunk driving, there have been community actions and industry actions to advertise against drunk driving, to provide Ubers for people who've been drinking. And there are college campuses where you don't have, if you're a student and you've been drinking, the university will pay for an Uber. You don't even need to pay for the Uber. And so these things grow up because there is liability. And in the absence of that, you don't encourage responsible action. So the fact that there's no similar immunity for the alcohol industry, no similar immunity for the car industry, for the knife industry, for the chainsaw industry, for a whole host of industries that make, inherently dangerous products, it explains that you can continue to manufacture and make products in this country, even when you're held to a responsible standard of care.
Sandy and Lonnie, Robin mentioned.
Can I just say, Igor, that your dog is totally stealing the show?
Oh, thank you. Yes, this is Tracer, and there's another one, Zima here. They're the stars of all my Zoom calls. Sandy and Lonnie, Robin mentioned that 2% of dealers, these bad apples, as some call them, are really responsible for a lot of the crime guns and ammunition that we see used in homicides across the country. I wonder, what more do you know about Lucky Gunner? Of course, that's that online ammunition store that sold so many rounds of ammunition to the man who killed your daughter.
Well, not only did they sell 4,000 rounds of ammunition, 223 screen tipped, that are designed to go through walls and seats and tissue and flesh and all of that. They also sold him the canister and his tactical gear.
No, that was BP and other.
Oh, I'm sorry. I take that back.
We sued someone besides Lucky Gunner. We also sued 3 other people
Yes.
that sold his tactical gear. He didn't buy them all in one place. But yeah, we sued all of them.
But the fact that there are online sellers that do this all the time, every conversation that we've had with someone, when we tell them our story, it's like, you do understand that if this particular person who killed our daughter was able to do that, there are other people with bad intentions that are doing the same thing. I'll be very curious if we ever find out from the insurrection where a lot of people are doing their shopping, and how easy it is to get whatever you want without producing an ID or proving that the credit card you're using is yours or showing that you're of age. So we have a real problem in this country. And I know some people are talking about insurance on guns and taxing ammo. And we're looking, I think, as a movement, we're looking for any answers we can get, anything that we can try to hold the industry accountable. So the problems that we have in the United States with guns, of course, is like nothing else anywhere else in the world. And we have to be as imaginative as possible, because unfortunately, like I said earlier, when we were all just chatting, we've had over 25 years of no action from the federal government, and people are dying every day.
So with the people we sued, it's business as usual. They didn't slow down a bit, probably it embolden them to do more. So
I mean, why would you correct yourself if you don't have to, right?
we were hoping that they would, we didn't ask for money. We thought maybe if we could just say, look, be civil here, be conscious of your fellow citizens, just do a little bit more than you're doing. No.
Well, and to that point, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sandy, I believe you not too long ago connected me with another survivor of a mass shooting where that shooter also obtained ammunition from Lucky Gunner. Is that right, or am I confusing?
No, you're right. And how awful for me that I'm trying to remember exactly who that was. But yes, it was the Lucky Gunner connection that we had when we got to talking, and they were trying to find a way to also take action until they talked to us and found out it's not a good idea right now. But hopefully in the future that will change and they'll get some restitution and some justice.
Robin, we have a question from our audience, specifically about the status of the Sandy Hook family's lawsuit. This is a lawsuit that has moved forward, that was able to find a way to move forward outside of Placa. Can you give us just some background on that case, where that case stands now?
My recollection is, and hopefully if I'm wrong, Congressman Schiff can correct me, is that the family survived the motion for summary judgment. It was actually a motion to dismiss, so an early stage attempt to get rid of the case on Placa grounds, and the court held that there was enough question of fact still remaining as to whether it was foreseeable that that gun would end up being used in the type of mass shooting that it was used in, to move into the discovery phase. And that's very exciting for those of us that want to see how the industry responds when they have to present information about what they know. We believe, I believe, and I think the families are arguing that the industry knows and understands that the way they're marketing these products, the language they're using in advertisements, the way that they're putting it out there, really is to sell this idea of being able to kill a large number of people in a small amount of time. And that's exactly what these products are intended to do. I don't know if any of you followed the Judge Benitez decision in California a little over a week ago. And part of what that judge says that has gotten a lot of play is that these weapons, these assault style weapons, are like a Swiss Army knife. They can be used for home defense and defense of the country. And I think that's a really telling comment, because you talk to folks in the military and they'll tell you that this is a battlefield weapon and that they're being marketed to civilians to enable them to behave in the way you would on a field of battle. So the case survived a motion to dismiss it. Now it's in the discovery phase. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what kind of information comes out as to communications within the industry about their knowledge and understanding of how these weapons are being marketed and used, and whether it was foreseeable, in fact, and was being marketed almost intentionally for this type of terrible tragedy. Representative Schiff, yeah.
Yeah, I think everything you said is correct. I also believe, though, that many of the claims that the Sandy Hook families filed were in fact dismissed, but at least one of them survived. And I think the claim that did survive was one that was based on the marketing of this. And there is what you could call, I guess, a loophole in Placa. If there's a violation of a predicate law, some underlying law, and the allegation here was that it violated the state law on false advertising, false marketing. So there was, I think, a very deliberate effort to plead around Placa. But most of the claims, I think, fell nonetheless. And this, while it's certainly positive that the plaintiffs, the Sandy Hook plaintiffs, were successful in at least one of their claims, it may not be the strongest claim. It just may be the claim that isn't explicitly barred by Placa. The Supreme Court denied cert in the case. The gun industry appealed, which means that it is going to go to trial now, and it will be up to the state courts to adjudicate. It still, I suppose, could be taken back to federal court thereafter and go back to the Supreme Court on a different basis. But it's certainly positive that at least one of the claims in Sandy Hook was allowed to go forward.
I just wanted to add one more quick thing, which is I think that question of false advertising, we sometimes internally, when we talk about the industry, talk about the big lie, right? This big lie that the industry is promoting, that guns make you safer, and that having a gun in your home or on you in public actually makes you safer and allows you to protect your family and make them safer. And in fact, the evidence shows the contrary, which is that guns create a risk and that there's no acknowledgement of that risk. And so false advertising and the question of how the industry is talking about their products and the risk they represent, I think is a really interesting conversation for another day, but does play into this case because that conversation falls theoretically outside of Placa.
Igor, I'd like to, one thing I'd like to offer on the Sandy Hook thing, it goes to my point about changing norms in the industry. That was a Bushmaster rifle that was used on that horrible day in December 2012. And that rifle was advertised by Bushmaster. It was a very controversial thing at the time, but the slogan on the advertisement was "Get your man card back." So that's an example of sort of the changing norms and maybe some of the repercussions.
Ryan, I was also going to go to you because Robin referenced that California, a case in which the judge struck down California's assault weapon ban. And as she noted, he compared these assault weapons to Swiss Army knives. As someone who sold firearms for 2 decades and worked in the industry, how did you react when you saw that kind of comparison?
So obviously it's not a laughable comparison, but it has become a somewhat apt comparison in the world of firearms because AR-15s are so ubiquitous and can be, modified in so many ways. That does not mean they're like a knife. They're obviously a very, very deadly and very serious weapon, and we should treat them as such. And I think as firearms owners and as manufacturers, we have a responsibility to treat and market these things like what they actually are. We should not minimize them. There's a popular tactical catchphrase across the internet. If you look at it, the hashtag is called pew pew. It reduces the noise that guns make to something a toddler could say, right? That's just not a responsible thing to do. And the industry encourages that. Social media encourages that. Now we have judges that now encourage it to be those things to be compared to a Swiss Army knife. They're serious tools, and we all know they're serious tools.
You know, one other thing the judge said in that opinion, which shows that there are more problems in this opinion than the comparison of an assault weapon with a Swiss Army knife. He also made the astounding and false claim that more people are killed by the COVID vaccine than by assault weapons. And I don't know where on earth he came up with such a bogus claim. In fact, when my staff first alerted me to it, I thought he couldn't possibly have said something so inane and so contrary to the public health interest in getting people vaccinated. So there's a lot wrong with that opinion, and I certainly hope it's overturned on appeal. But it does show you that some of these extreme opinions go hand in hand with others. And in this case, apparently, the view that everyone has a right to their own assault weapon, everything short of apparently a bazooka, and the campaign against vaccination are a marriage of certain interests.
I'd also like to jump in, and I'd like to ask the judge, I'd like to show him a picture of somebody who's been stabbed 6 times with a Swiss Army knife versus somebody who's been shot 6 times with an AR-15. And you tell me where that compares. I can show you. I can tell you.
Congressman, we have a question from our audience asking you about the politics of Placa. What will it take to get this law across the finish line? And as you've reintroduced this law, have you seen support grow over time? What are you hearing from your colleagues, especially, of course, those on the other side of the aisle about your repeal bill?
Well, I have seen, I've been in Congress now for over 20 years, and I've seen a very strong growth, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, of sentiment of people willing to take on the gun industry and fight for common sense reforms. It was most notable to me in the midterm elections a couple of years ago, when I saw people in typically very difficult House districts not running away from the gun issue, but running towards the gun issue. People like Jason Crow campaigning in Colorado, and not shying away from his support for responsible gun laws. In fact, he was making the point when it comes to assault weapons that, hey, you know, I carried one when I was in the service, when I was in Iraq. You want to carry one, join the service. Do what I did, join the service. But they don't really have a place on our city streets. And so that's, you know, he's in a purple district. Many others in even more conservative districts are now embracing common sense reform issues because they're supported by not only a majority of Americans, but a majority of NRA members. I do think that the movement to embrace the repeal of Placa is not moving as fast as the movement, for example, for universal background checks or a ban on extended ammunition clips or a ban on assault weapons. And I think the reason is that people understand that this would go right in the teeth of a very powerful industry. And so that's why I mentioned at the outset that this bill will maybe the last pass, not the first, in terms of a number of gun safety priorities. But that's okay. We continue, I think, to make progress and gain support for the bill. And more generally, I think we are nearing a tipping point where it will be much more perilous for legislators to be against common sense gun measures than it will be to support them. And frankly, I want to congratulate all of the representatives of the gun safety organizations that are on this call, because your work and that of your supporters and your grassroots activists are really what's getting us to that tipping point. And once you do get to that tipping point, things can tip pretty fast. We've seen this on other issues. You work and you work and you work and you think you're never going to get there, and suddenly you do, and it's like you've broken the dam. And once you show that the industry can be beaten on one thing, you show can be beaten on another thing, and so we make progress.
You think of an issue like marriage equality, that just 20, 25 years ago, one would never think we'd be in a place where 70% of Americans, according to the latest polls, support marriage equality.
That was exactly the issue that I was thinking of, because, it wasn't so long ago that seemed beyond reach. I remember when I was in the state legislature, I cast a deciding vote for domestic partnership, and that was considered a huge thing at the time. So yes, on that issue and others, when things begin to move, they begin to move pretty fast.
Robin, a question from our audience. Could you give concrete examples of the types of negligence that overturning Placa would address? Some of it, of course, we've discussed here today.
Sure, and I think that's sort of what gets at the root of this. There's two primary players that we're discussing that benefit from the immunity that this law provides. There's dealers and there's manufacturers. And I think each of those have a different set of circumstances that surround their behaviors, which should be considered in terms of torts and negligence. For the industry, it has to do with how the product is produced and whether the product can be produced in a safer manner than it is being done. In law school, we talk a lot about toasters for some reason, because toasters are surprisingly more dangerous than they seem. And so when you have an accident with a toaster, they look at whether anyone's producing a safer toaster that could prevent that type of injury from happening. And if there is, you're negligent to not be making the toaster safer to prevent that injury. So it would, as we've been discussing here all evening, it would encourage the industry. It would almost be a race to the top of safety, right? If somebody comes up with a safer way to, a better trigger lock or a better chamber load indicator or some aspect of the gun that could make it a safer product, everyone else will have to follow suit. And that's the kind of race to the top that we want to encourage in all industries, innovation towards greater safety. And that's what cases of negligence would help spur on. Marketing, we've been talking quite a bit about tonight, the way products are marketed and the way that the risks are disclosed. Again, when you buy a toaster, it has a little tag, and the tag explains what all the risks are, so that when you buy that product, at a minimum, you're being told what the risks are, so you can also, as a consumer, be taking steps to be safer in using that product. So things like marketing practices, disclosure of risks, those are all things that would change dramatically, and we don't have now. On the dealer side, as Representative Schiff and others have mentioned, it would create an incentive for dealers to ensure that guns, to the extent they have the ability to collect that kind of information, to act in a safer way, whether it's individuals that buy the kinds of products that Lonnie and Sandy were talking about, and creating some incentive to put some stopgaps in there, whether it is the kinds of dealers we've been discussing who are clearly providing guns into the illegal market, like lost and stolen reporting laws tend to be really helpful with some of that, and dealer regulations. But ultimately, litigation is a huge incentive. So I think we'd create motivation across the board to voluntarily kind of take all of those steps to avoid litigation. So it could be a really broad range. And I think it would hit on a lot of areas that are contributing to the situation we're in with so many of these products.
Robin, if I only knew toasters were the focus of law school, I would have gone to law school.
I'm farther away from law school, and toasters were not a big thing when I was in law school, but I'm kind of afraid to go in the kitchen right now.
Well,
be careful.
As we close up, a lot of the questions coming in are really wondering what Americans all across the country in blue states and in red states can do to make progress on this issue, to repeal Placa, but also gun safety more generally. So as a final question, I'd just like to go around the panel. What would you offer to our viewers and listeners? What can they do to help build safer communities, starting with Ryan Busey?
I guess I would like to say I would like to encourage all of the gun owners out there who are fed up with the extreme voices in the gun movement to cast that aside and speak up for us reasonable gun owners. I know there are millions of them out there, and it's time that the mic be taken back from the radical extremes. So I encourage gun owners to step up and be a part of the solution.
Sandy and Lonnie?
Well, we're big on writing letters. We're big on phone calls. We're big on calling your representatives and scheduling a meeting and sitting down face to face and telling them why it's important to you as an individual. You're entitled to do that. I think people are intimidated about phoning their congressman or their senator and saying, I want to have a meeting with you and I want it about this. And it's easy. It's easy, isn't it, Congressman? It's easy. And in fact, the first meeting I got with Congressman Schiff was because I stopped him in the hallway in the Capitol while he was walking one direction and we were walking another. And I went, oh my God, Adam Schiff. And I think I scared him. And I said, I've been trying to schedule a meeting with you. And he immediately stopped what he was doing, took out a pen and a pencil, a pen and his business card, told me what number to call and said, do it now. And I'm going to call and make sure it happens. And it's that easy. I mean, you don't have to run into your congressman, but you do have to call. You can write emails. You can sign on to any petitions, any letters. Those all matter. And we ask that you do that. Take the time to do it. Do you have anything else?
Except we're gun owners also, and like
Yes.
Ryan said, every chance we get, we talk with them. We're working with Giffords and their gun owner safety programs. And I think gun owners is the key here. If you can get enough of them to stand up and talk back to these crazies, eventually, like the congressman said, it is a tipping point.
Yeah, we have to counterbalance the extremists. It's that simple.
Congressman Schiff?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, and Ryan, I appreciate your bringing your voice to this because I think it's a really valuable one. But members of Congress tend to respond to their constituents. It doesn't always seem that way, but they do. In part of the reason why it doesn't always seem that way is they don't always hear from the constituents they need to. They hear, from some of the loudest voices, and those loud voices often come from industry. And if your representative in Congress is already with you, the question is, how do you move these others? It doesn't generally, it's not all that effective generally if you're from one state and you want to try to move a representative from some other state. But what a lot of organizations do, which I think is very clever, is they identify people in other states who can weigh in with their own representative. And that can be very effective. I remember when we were facing potential repeal of the Affordable Care Act in my district in Hollywood, the LGBT Center set up a phone booth, a phone bank where people from my district could call people in Alaska that were identified as supporters of healthcare and urge them to call the senator from that state, Lisa Murkowski. And Lisa Murkowski was getting calls from her constituents. Now, those calls originated in my district, but they're effective, much more effective than if someone in my district calls Alaska. So there are lots of good efforts, some through organizations that are already on this call, where you can amplify your voice. And you can always reach out to your own representatives, because even if they're with you, they can be more actively with you. And they need to hear from you as well. So the most effective is in-person meetings when you can do that. It's not always possible. Zoom is not a bad substitute. and letters and emails if none of those things are possible. And every bit helps move the needle.
Robin Thomas, close us out. What can our viewers do to help make progress?
Oh, good. I get to close out. Well, I'll be quick because I know we're at time here, but I will say, in addition to what's already been mentioned, vote this issue. Vote for the candidates that are champions. Support them financially if you're able. Encourage others to do the same. It starts with educating yourself about not just this issue of Placa and then talking to your legislator about it, but educating yourself about where all of your elected representatives stand on gun safety and making sure you have your voice out there, saying over and over that this is an important issue to you. This is an issue you vote on because they care about that. This is where you put your treasure and your time. I mean, this is a way to move the needle over time as we begin to get, we know we have 90% of Americans that agree with this, but not all of them are raising their voices. So to be willing to speak up, to be willing to vote this issue and to advocate to others, not to be afraid to talk about this and put it into the conversation that we need to be having.
Well, with that, on behalf of Giffords, Survivors Empowered, Guns Down America, I want to thank all of you for taking part in this debate. Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for joining us. Do all of the things that we've encouraged you to do, and let's build safer communities. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.